And I'm 58, and I wasn't, I've been a lead pastor, and I wasn't used to guys talking to me that way. I really wasn't. I mean, Doc said some things to me that like, man, if you weren't so old, I'd take you out back or something,
Beat you senseless.
Yeah, but I knew that I needed it, and it rang so true.
Welcome to the Advancement Podcast. This is Taylor Shote with Tim Ware, the president of Advancement Coaching and Consulting. Today, we will be discussing practical insights for pastors and church leaders to advance your life, your work, and your ministry. Are you ready to advance?
Joining us for a special series on spiritual heritage are Dr. Wayne Lee and Dr. Mike Harper. We'd like to thank our sponsor today, the Bridge Church in Hutto, Texas, where Pastors David and Michelle McLean are leading the church to impact the community of Hutto. Now we're going to talk about, this is episode 4. We've talked in this series on Spiritual Descendants with Doc and Mike and Taylor. So we've talked about what is spiritual heritage, why it was important, why it's important today. And we talked last time about being a spiritual descendant. And now we're going to talk about the idea of being a spiritual parent, a father or a spiritual mother.
Yeah. Tim, as a spiritual son, there was a season in my life where I really didn't recognize the spiritual dynamic between our relationship. But as I grew in that, I began to look back of when did the relationship shift for me, where I stopped seeing you as just a guy in my life or man in my life, but started seeing, man, Tim really stepped up to the role of father. And it was when my biological dad had just passed away. In fact, we were doing his funeral. And I think I was 16 at the time. And I remember the funeral. We talked about this the other day. A lot of people showed up for our family. And I couldn't tell you hardly any of their names, but I could tell you 3 people that showed up that day, and you were one of them. I remember you showing up that day to my dad's funeral, and that left a lasting impact on my life. And in this conversation, as we prepared for these episodes, I thought back, that was the day in my life that it started, the view of the relationship started to shift.
There is something different. I know in this role that the day that, for those who don't know, and that, for Taylor and Morgan to get pregnant, it's been a journey.
It's been a journey.
It's been a journey, and it's been honestly weren't sure you were ever going to be able to conceive. And the day you called me and I was driving down the road and you said, we're pregnant, I began to cry. I still get emotional. I began to cry because there is something that shifts in the relationship in this spiritual heritage piece. I even think that sometimes for me in this spiritual fathering piece, when I look at the other people who I'm beginning to consider, feel like might be that, I realize that there's a deeper connection to their family and to all those personal concerns that I begin to carry that weight of all that peace in them. So I'm excited to talk about this whole piece. And earlier we said that being a spiritual parent is not just being a mentor or a coach or a consultant. Yes, it is being a mentor, coach, and consultant, but it's so much more than just that. So let's talk about what is that? What is it, and how do we do it? So we're going to look to the guys that have been doing it longer in the room than us.
You start the conversation, and then I'll add in.
What is it to do it?
Or to be it? I mean, what is it?
For me, I can only talk from my own personal experiences. To be it was to be the object of someone's focus. That, number one, I admired. I don't think I would have...
As a father?
As a father. I admired him as a father. I admired Doc. That's what got my attention. And I think to have that focus reciprocated was significant. Someone who had grown churches. Those external things were the things that caught my attention about Doc. The man who recruited me to come here, Doc, his name was Craig Carter. He said, come here, a guy who does Pentecostal consulting. I'm like, what is that, like new math or something? What is that, and
a Pentecostal can't be a consultant.
yeah. And so I went and I heard him, and I was like, I heard things I'd never heard before. So I was drawn. There was a drawing to him because it was, here again, as I said earlier, I was in transition, and I was looking and asking God, what's next? And that drawing piece of his knowledge, his influence, his posture, his demeanor, all those things were things that I looked to, and I was like, wow, his comportment, the way he carried himself, was different from the other.
Nice word.
Thank you. Was so different from many of the people that I had been dealing with, and so I was curious about him. And then when we started communicating, talking, we were joking. He identified one of my hot buttons. He didn't even know it was a hot button, and he challenged me on something. And I'm like, hey, man, you're challenging the wrong guy. I'm going to go after this. Those things drew me to him, and so there was this attractional piece. We've talked about it in our breaks, but there was this fatherly, spiritual component that I kind of call an apostolic kind of not an office, but this role, this ability to father multiple people and to look beyond just the one I saw in him.
So all right, let's clarify that. What being a father, I felt like I heard you say that that there's a piece of the father focusing on the son. Yeah. You receiving his focus. I think, is that what he said when he started that?
I think
before
so,
he said
my rabbit trail.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There's no rabbit trail.
Yeah. The way I see it, from the father point of view, is I see the holistic person, and then I begin to ask the question, where does God want this person to go, and how can I be the instrument or an instrument in that process? You immediately see more than what you can say, both positive and negative. And you begin to recognize, I've got to be cautious on what I say, because I'm going to influence this guy either in the wrong direction or the right direction. So you immediately begin to be protective. You begin to see the holistic elements, and you're right. The family comes in. Right. You begin to be concerned about the children, about the mate, finding the characteristics. I was always concerned about the frailties of human flesh. And I would always warn him about women, sex, and
as a traveling guy,
money on the road,
money, and power, I always political power. It's nasty stuff. Stay away from it. And so I would want to protect him. I don't want him to get hurt. And I don't want him to fall into the normal temptations that a minister falls into. So as a father, you begin to see the possibilities. When we came out of the restroom and I said, we will see, he interpreted it as a son. I interpreted it, and that is, it was negative. I interpreted as, oh, good. Let's see what God will do. Wow. And so I never saw him in a negative light. I always saw him in a positive light. And I really think that he can do more than what he thinks he can do, because I can see the larger perspective. So as a father, you see the whole thing. You realize, I can't say everything that I see, but I try to push it toward the positive as much as I can.
So it's not just a concern, and what you said is, and I see it in our relationship. It's not just a concern for who God is, what God is calling, and the vision He's placed on their life and the gifts, but it's actually a sense that as a father, I feel somewhat of a weight to protect the anointing in them, not just the anointing in my own life.
Right, exactly right. No, it's nothing to do with me.
Right.
It's them.
Right. I mean, we have a responsibility, but I feel an added piece that I have to protect the anointing in their life, or those gifts. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that exact context, but that's really good. So what else, when we talk about being a spiritual father, what does it entail? Maybe how do we do that? How does it work out? Let's say it this way. How does it work out practically? Because the guys listening to this are saying, okay, y'all been talking about it for weeks now, and I feel like this relationship is developing, and I've got some sons. What are the practical pieces? One, you mentioned a few episodes ago that you can't father everybody.
Right.
You gotta, we said that you gotta know your limits. Jesus had 12, and but I'm not saying that, but what are the limits? You can't father everybody. So maybe that's a good question. How do we delineate between who is a son or a potential descendant and those that are just the mentor moments when we look at it from the fatherhood perspective? Because you're looking for spiritual sons. You realize you want to pass this on.
Right.
So how do we help this guy recognize that next step?
I think with mine and your relationship, we started off kind of peerish.
I never felt that way.
Oh, really? See, I did.
I never felt that way. I was calling him for help all the time. I need help.
Yeah, but I really maybe it's because of the proximity of our age.
Okay.
And you were already in ministry, and you were, you're not a young punk, kid who doesn't have any experience or green around the ears or grills, whatever language you want to use. So I viewed you more as a peer, but as we moved into it, I began to see some areas in your life that I could help you with. I could help you see. I never was looking for a son. I didn't look at you as a son. In fact, I never even thought of that language till you referred to me that way. Mm. So I wasn't even thinking that we had this. What I have here. I was just thinking, man, I love this guy. I see such potential in him. I really care about his family. We talk about our families. I've not had this kind of open, transparent communication about things with a peer in a long time. And it began to feel more formal of a relationship than it just was like casual. And we began to be very intentional about getting our times together, traveling together, things we talk about. We called it windshield time, just driving on the road. And it felt organic. It didn't feel contrived. Right. It didn't feel like, I'm looking for a son, so I'm going to go out and find somebody. It just felt like that God kind of merged a path together, because I called you out of the blue asking you for help on something. And if you'd have walked in the room that day, I wouldn't have known who you were. So our path, there was a real divine connection.
That's the
there,
word that comes to it.
that I felt. And I felt the same way with Doc. I didn't know who he was. I went to hear him, and this divine connection. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a part of that. Yours was divine, but it was 12, 13 years ago, but it was still just as divine as it is.
I think that's part of it when you recognize the difference that in a mentor and a coach, that some of these relationships, they all have the potential, but when you begin to look at it, you recognize there is that sense where you go, okay, there's something different. You can sense the divinity in it. Right. When you can recognize the divinity in it, that it's something significant. So so I guess what we're saying is there's something divine in it that makes it go deeper.
It appeared in Paul's situation, and I see it in my own situation, that when there is purpose to do a ministry together or to do something together, or when I take on the prayer of that person, then the relationship gets a little bit more structured, because I'm a structured person in my mind.
Yes, you are.
I think of his various areas. I think of his spiritual area. I think of his relational area. I think of his knowledge area, and I think of his outreach area. And so I'm concerned. Whatever is the lagging one is going to be his level of immaturity. And so I always, when I'm praying for him, I'm trying to pick up on the urgency of God, or what should be talked about. And so when I come to a relational time, I have thought through it, and if there's any concerns that I have, then I'm going to bring them up in the relationship.
I always, people say I'm structured, but when I get around Doc, I always feel like such a wimp. I feel like such a blob, because I feel like I fall short.
I think in what Doc is saying, we had a conversation just a couple of days ago, and he's a conversation we've been having, significant for both of us, and just kind of. And I've been the laggard here. I've been the person kind of lagging behind, and said to him, I was in an event and went to the altar, had a time of prayer, and I felt like the Lord said this to me. And Doc said, well, I'm glad, because he's been talking to me about that for you for a long time, And so there's this divine piece that's there, that suddenly I'm not operating as a mono minister out here. I have another person
or a mono person.
I'm just not here on my own. There really is someone besides my spouse.
Right.
My spouse is, when we have these same kind of conversations, but there's a different aspect. We often don't talk about the divine pieces as much as Doc and I talk about the divine. So here again, it comes back to that sense of identity. For me, these big words: who is God calling you to be?
Right.
What's God calling you to do? Doc doesn't concern about how many churches we planted or how big this thing is. We never talk about that. What we talk about is what's God saying to you, God's calling you to do, who's God asking you to be, where's your next level of sacrifice. Yeah. We have that conversation quite frequently, and so it's so refreshing, because we don't get that anywhere else. And I think those are the kinds of things that define that fatherly relationship.
Do you find that? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting. Tim, you'll recall this a couple months ago, when Morgan and I are serving. We love it, and I was essentially offered a position in a new position somewhere that I had jokingly said one day I would love to work for this organization, and it was a lofty position, and in all realms for a young guy, it would have been amazing to have.
Right.
And when I first got that offer, I'll be honest, like my mind was like, what? You would consider me? And I called Tim. It was one of those moments. I called Tim, and Tim asked me those same questions. Who has God called you to be? What has he called you to do? And does that fit? And truthfully, like for this whole conversation that we're having here, that was a father moment that I needed, because I could have. I mean, maybe if I would have spent some time to pray about it, but in that moment, I wasn't going to pray about it.
Yeah. Who prays about this?
Yeah. But to me, when you're talking about how do you be a parent, it's recognizing some of those moments of what needs to be the anchor here, and that's what you do for me often. Is you anchor it back, not about you. And not even about me becoming what Taylor wants to become, but who has you ask those same questions Mike just mentioned. What is God calling you to do? Who is he calling you to be? And whatever circumstance you're in, does it align to that? And so it's an alignment piece.
I find that sometimes when that the father takes that personal view, but when we end up talking about how many churches or what's going on in the church, it's always the son coming to the father, and the father, I'll give you advice on that. Yeah. But then we come back to this other point. There's something bigger than that. So I think that's another piece that not only is there a recognizable divine component, but what I hear us talking about is that there is that fathering always takes the larger view, looks at the view, the longer, bigger picture piece.
Yeah.
Okay,
that's a great insight that the father takes the more helicopter view, the longer view. I find myself with Mike because prayer is my thing. Yes. I find myself going out ahead of him and taking on difficulties in prayer that he will eventually have to take on. And that's a father does that. A father says, let's see where he's going. Let me see if I can help him make a way. And it because of the concern. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with me. It has to do with what God has for that individual life.
Wow. One of the things I've heard also alluded to, and you mentioned it in an earlier episode, one of the things that fathers do also is, it's not that as mentors we don't open networks up, but we really, it's, as being a descendant, I have to give access, but as a parent, I share access. Yeah. I create access. I create opportunities. I create opportunities because I love you.
Right.
I give away my opportunities to you because I want that for you. Right. I want more for you.
Exactly right.
I don't, I can't count the times that even both of you guys have given me access and before I deserved it too. You pushed me out there.
Yeah, it's always that way. The father does it, and whatever lumps have to be taken. The father takes it. The father takes them.
It's true. Yeah. It is true.
Oh, yeah. He has taken them from me.
And?
Yeah, it's just part of it. But it's that, here again, it's that desire to see that spiritual descendant move at a level that they don't know that they can move at, and to experience what they don't know they can experience. And part of the joy is putting them at the table and seeing the wonder that they're having at that table, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm sitting here talking to this person, or I'm in a room that, well, my peers would kill to be in here, that my spiritual father allows me to come with them on. That's one of the greatest joys that I have.
Yeah, that's the life I feel like I live with Tim, and then even you guys. The first time I met Mike was because of you, sitting in a room that I knew I had no reason to be in. I probably wasn't smart enough to know not to open my mouth in the room, but I have seen that played out in my life where Tim has opened up. What I know as a son to Tim is that there's not an area of his network that if I needed or wanted to see into, that he wouldn't show me.
Wow.
You guys realize how rare this is. It feels even uncomfortable talking about this because it is so rare sometimes. It ought not to be that way, but it is.
In the break, you mentioned the fact that we really haven't talked about this much. And Mike talked about that alignment piece in the very first episode of this series. It's a forgotten conversation, and I think talking about being a spiritual parent, we're all still stumbling around. It's not. I don't know that we have it clearly defined. Of course not. Clearly, it's tough for us to talk about it. Which now I want you to go back for a second, and you mentioned it in one of the first or second episode, and you talked about that shift of going from command to it was control.
No,
what was it?
Command, counsel, concern, of this cycle that as a spiritual father, or even as an earthly father, natural father, you kind of lead your children, your descendants, through these different positions that you take. The first is, early on, even when you and I were having some conversations,
Don't talk.
You can't talk.
to people that way.
You can't talk. And the same thing with me. It was command. Don't talk to that guy that way. You're not old enough. You're not mature enough. But after a while, you don't make those mistakes anymore. And then it's more out of counsel. If I was you in this situation, or we'd get in the car. Okay, what did you think? You and I had these conversations.
Oh, Father, help
So what'd you think you did well here today?
Yeah.
Where did you think you messed up? What other language could we have used in that environment to make a better communication pattern?
Yeah.
So it's more counsel. It's more peer. It's that. And then the third level, where you and I are, it's just concern. Hey, I see this coming. Doc, with me, it's more concern, and with you see the concern, and so it's leading where I don't have. Doc allows me to make my decisions. Yeah. He's concerned that I'm going to make the right one.
Well, the guy that you heard that from, the story, there was a quote in the story, him telling that he said he felt like the Lord said, what was if you only want to raise boys?
Yeah,
or
he
something?
said, I'll allow you to only raise boys if you want to, but if you're going to learn to raise men, spiritual sons who have sons of their own, you've got to move from just being command focused.
That's great.
To more of this counsel, and to recognize the stage that they are in.
That's huge.
I think that's the big part of it, is that you and I have changed. Our relationship is richer and deeper, but you have changed and I have changed as well. And Doc in my relationship I have seen that command piece from Doc, very directive, very, and I'm 58, and I wasn't. I've been a lead pastor, and I wasn't used to guys talking to me that way. I really wasn't. I mean, Doc said some things to me that, like, man, if you weren't so old, I'd take you out back or something,
Beat you senseless.
Yeah, but I knew that I needed it, and it rang so true. And then we grew, and our relationship grew. I developed. I think the pace of the cycles. It's incumbent upon the leader to recognize, or the father to recognize, where that child is. And I think those transition points are the most difficult.
That's really good. So can I ask a different question? We talked about this in our production piece. It just happens that everyone here is not just, the father's actually naturally older. We're older but is that for the person who's a leader, is it about natural age? Could Taylor actually be a spiritual father to someone who's 10 years older than him? Is that something that could happen? I don't know the answer, so I'm looking this way because we said,
I don't think that has very much to do with chronological age. I think it has to.
Give me the word I couldn't remember.
I think it has more to do with spiritual maturity and spiritual age.
Okay.
And now you have to be sensitive to those age differences, and so maybe in those various stages, you don't. I probably should have spoken differently. To my
probably not. I probably needed it. If you really know me.
He said, what was it he said earlier? He said, I want to be tender.
Well,
who is this man?
I have it in my notes. Speak tenderly to your sons.
I've never done it. Why don't one of you guys try it?
No, I had in parentheses, unless they're hardheads, unless they're knotheads, then speak strongly to them. No, I think you ought to be tender, and if there's an age difference, you've got to cut back your intensity sometimes, and make sure that the tone is right. But I do feel like that it's chronological age is not the deal. It's spiritual.
What they're looking for, what's attractional, is the anointing and the authority, which has nothing to do with age.
Right. That's good.
That's what I was drawn to. The anointing and that authority there. That's what a son is looking for in a spiritual father.
Right.
We're really running a little long, but before we do the wrap, there was a story you told. You told a story at the beginning of our first episode in this series, but during our break, there were a couple of things you said about a couple of other people in that meeting that I think are significant in this father component.
Yeah. So the meeting we had, we gathered a group of men. So what's God doing in your life? And the one young man says, I feel this longing for a spiritual father. Well, following up from that, another gentleman stood up and said, I feel like God has done significant amount of work in my life that I know I need to pass on to somebody. And so here's a man going, what I heard him say is, I want to be a father. I've got something that God has done that I want to not hoard for myself, but to pass it on. And then another guy even got up and said, God's doing something, recently has done something in my life. I don't know how to be, I don't know how to pass this on, but I know that I need to. And then it was evident to us that day that not only are there sons crying out for fathers, but fathers going, I want to leave a legacy.
Yeah.
Well, I think in that break, Pete, when you told that story, I think the word I used was also being a father means I have to take a step of faith.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to know how to do it.
Right.
There is no necessary. I have to be willing to take a risk and actually be a father. Otherwise, I just have to take that risk piece. And you taught us that following the Lord's, you say, is like walking into a dark room where there's just a string hanging out there, and I don't always know where it is till I find it. But somewhere there, we have our churches are full of people who have things, but whether it's I don't know, is it reluctance? What is it that keeps people kept us from engaging this side? What is it that is, I don't know that the phrase is it lack of knowledge? Is it lack of encouragement? Is it, I don't know what it is, but there has to be a faith piece to this. You guys are nodding yes. I don't know if there's.
I'm thinking in the next series.
in the next session. You're right.
In the next session, we're going to say.
Oh, that's true.
How do we do this in church?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I do feel like we need to get into the content of that in the next session.
So here's what I've got from here's what we've said about being a father, that being a father means I've got to focus on the entirety of the being of the descendant. That there's a value and concern for who they are and where they're going more than what they're doing. And maybe as big as anything is we recognize that divine component in the relationship. And that a parent seems to always take a longer view, a higher view, the helicopter view of the situation. And that parenting means we create access and opportunities. And I love that last piece, that we learn to recognize the stage of development they're in and try to lead them accordingly. And then that this whole thing's a risk of faith that we just have to be willing to jump into. So you want to let's go back to you, because you're really in a place of learning to be and looking to be a spiritual father. So what's the takeaway from this?
I think the biggest takeaway, it wasn't stated this way, but it's what I heard Doc say a minute ago. He said, you see more than what you can say, whether positive or negative. But what I sensed was being said is where God is giving you influence, where He's going to open up a door of influence in someone's life. And it's more than the mentorship. There's a door there's a door that's been opened by both sides. The father is opening a door and the son's opening a door, the parent child, and God's giving influence in a relationship. And that's the biggest. God's doing that right now in a young man in my life, that I'm in these sessions, I'm realizing, man, God's doing something divine in that relationship.
So for you leaders who are out there, as we wrap up today, let me ask you this question. If you've seen yourself as a spiritual parent, a spiritual father, spiritual mother, what are the components where you feel like you need to work on to strengthen and become a better parent? Thank you, guys.
Thank you for joining us today on the Advancement Podcast. The show notes are available on our website at www.advancement.cc, along with other resources. Again, this is Taylor Schode on behalf of Tim Ware and the entire advancement team. We want you to remember that you are meant to advance.